I used to make fun of people who swore their houses were haunted. I would roll my eyes, make a joke about drafts and bad wiring, and then go back to whatever show I was half watching on my couch. Then 3 nights, or 3 different lives, depending on how you want to count it, pulled the floor out from under that certainty. I'm telling you these because they're true. They happened to me or to people I trusted. I sat in those rooms. I smelled those smells. I watched those things happen and had no explanation to offer other than, I don't know. If you like real, inexplicable horror, leave a comment. If anything here feels familiar, tell me. It helps somehow to know I'm not the only one lying awake. The first thing I ever sat through that made me rethink everything happened at my friend Steve's house. Steve lives far enough outside town that the sky is pure black at night, and the nearest streetlight is an apology someone forgot to make. He has a golden retriever, big, soft, the kind of dog that makes you forgive everything, even early morning alarm sprints through your kitchen. He asked me to watch the place for the weekend because he and his wife had to be out of town. I don't babysit often, but I like getting away from my apartment, so I agreed. I told myself it would be a cozy break, movies, takeout, the comfort of a living room big enough to lose yourself in. The first night was easy. We stayed up over terrible action movies and leftovers. The dog, Max, curled at the foot of the spare bed where I slept, breathing like a small, steady engine. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I woke up and thought I heard something. A scrape, a soft echo, the kind of house noise you only notice when every other noise stops. I turned over, half asleep, and listened. Max's breathing was slow, steady. I told myself it was the house settling and rolled over again. At 3:21 a.m., Max exploded into a barking fit like a freight train had hit the backyard. It wasn't a little alarm, the kind that says, "Someone's at the door." This was different, deep, constant, all the dog that dog can be. His fur was standing on end, every hair pricked like he'd been electrocuted. He sprinted to the bedroom door and hammered on it with his front paws, whining at a pitch that made my skin crawl. He didn't stop when I sat up. He didn't stop when I called him. He wouldn't climb back into bed. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, the cheap, legit metal knife I keep in the house for opening boxes because I have never been a person who sleeps without a small, ridiculous piece of security. I told myself I wasn't scared. I was being prudent. I cracked the bedroom door and stuck my head into the hallway. The house smelled different, like someone had left a window open and a dead pocket of air had been trapped in the basement. It was colder than it should have been for late May. The air that hit me felt like the inside of a refrigerator. You could see your breath for a second when you exhaled. Max was at the base of the basement door, barking, hair raised, leaning his whole weight against it. He was trying to get something out of the door or keep something in. I couldn't tell which. The light from my phone carved a path down the stairs and then vanished into that low, humming dark. The metal cold of the doorknob radiated in a way human skin doesn't normally register. I told myself I was being silly, that I'd probably just misplugged the heater and it had tripped a draft, but Max kept barking. I cracked the basement door open and poked my head in. The electric bulb above the low ceiling hummed. The stairs led down into a room stacked with boxes, and the smell, a sour chemical stink, rolled up and around me. I stepped inside, and the temperature seemed to drop another 5 degrees. My breath fogged out immediately. The flashlight showed nothing at first, just boxes, an old washer and dryer, a rusted tool cart. Then I noticed one of the framed photos on the workbench had been knocked off its hook and lay, face down, in the thin dust. A bar stool that had been sitting nice and tidy by the counter was toppled over like someone had bumped it. The whole space seemed unnerved, like it had been compressed and then released. No one was down there. Nothing that looked like a human was hiding behind the boxes. I stood for a moment, the knife in my hand suddenly heavy and absurd, and wondered if maybe a raccoon had come in. But raccoons don't make a dog bristle with fear like that. Max's barking had a cadence like mourning. It wasn't just noise, it was an appeal. I went back upstairs, told myself everything was fine, and tried to sleep. I didn't sleep. At dawn, when the house warmed and light crept through the curtains, the smell had disappeared. The photo was back on the hook. The stool was upright as if someone had taken time to tidy. I tried to tell myself I had misremembered the toppled stool. Maybe I'd knocked it over in a half-dream. Steve's wife texted that afternoon. She joked about me eating all their food and told me not to burn anything. I didn't tell them about the basement smell. I didn't tell them about the cold. The second night was worse. I told myself I should have stayed in town, should have been the reasonable person who prefers a well-lit security camera world. But I'd already committed to staying. We had another movie, some snacks. Max seemed fine during the evening, happy, big, tail flicking like the world was fine. Then, at 3:21 a.m., the barking started again. This time it escalated almost immediately. He sounded more frantic, like a storm was converging at that basement door. When I opened the door, the smell hit me before I saw anything. It was a heavy, copper tang smell, metallic and rotten, as if someone had opened an old wound and left it breathing. The air in the basement felt viscous. One of the photographs on the wall had been knocked askew. A small cluster of dust was on the floor like a hand had dragged across it. The bar stool that had been tidy was now not only toppled, but placed in an odd position, as if it had been pushed from the middle of the room to the corner in a hurried motion. Max had watermarks on his paws, like he'd been sliding across something slick. I checked the perimeter, flashlights sweeping right and left, expecting to find an animal nest or a creature of some kind. Nothing. There were scuff marks along the wall near the stairs that didn't belong to any of Steve's known collection of clumsy weekend projects. There was also in one corner the sickening sensation of being watched. It wasn't a sight, it was a weight in your chest, like someone had pressed a palm against your sternum. I walked the stairs as quickly as I could and slammed the door, locking it with hands that trembled just a little. We tried to laugh it off the next day. Steve called that afternoon and said, "Max was always weird as a puppy, used to freak out for no reason." And that's when Steve told me, almost offhand, that he'd noticed odd behavior in the dog when he first adopted him, small things that he'd dismissed. I'm telling you this because the idea that a creature responds to something unseen is more convincing than any single human testimony. Animals, the way people talk about them, tend to notice things we don't. The third night felt like crossing a line. The sound started earlier this time, a soft whining under the house, a vibration under the floorboards that you felt more than heard. It was like the house itself inhaled. The basement door rattled on its own for a moment before the barking began. Max was pacing now, up and down the hallway, ears pinned back, lips pulled tight. He kept looking at the bottom of the stairs, not down, just at it, as if he could see the threshold with a second sight. When I pulled the latch and descended, it was worse than before. The air was colder, the smell thicker, and there was a dampness on the floor that traced a path from the back wall to the steps. The little framed photo was face down, and a second larger frame that had hung there for years now leaned broken against the wall. In the center of the room was a child's shoe, one of those small rubber playground shoes, clean, as if placed there carefully rather than left. The shoe wasn't Steve's. It wasn't something I would expect in his basement. There was a small smear on the stair rail, the color of old rust or dried tea, and when I ran my finger across it, the smell flared, making my eyes water. I retreated upstairs and called Steve's wife, trying to keep my voice steady. She answered, and for a second the sound of her voice felt like a lifeline. I told her about the shoe and the smell. There was an audible pause on the line. "Weird," she said quietly. "There was something. When Max was a puppy, he used to fixate on the basement sometimes. We'd keep him away." That was all she said. She didn't explain it. She didn't offer a reason. She deferred to logistics. Maybe he forgot. and then tried to change the subject. You can tell a lot about how people react when they don't offer an explanation. There was the classic human shrug at the borders of something that makes no sense. That night, when the house fell into the kind of silence that presses against your ears, I sat cross-legged on the floor, with the knife across my knees, and Max curled at my side, still shivering. The temperature in the living room was normal. The thermostat said it was fine, but the living room felt like an island of warm air surrounded by a cold sea. Every so often, Max would lift his head and whisper a low whine, then press his muzzle into my hand like he wanted reassurance, which was ridiculous because the only person who should be doing the reassuring was me. At around 4 in the morning, Max bolted upright and ran to the bedroom door. This time he didn't bark. He stood there rigid, then put his paws to the door and looked at me as though he'd already made a decision. He scratched at the seam and then retreated and backed into the hallway like someone who didn't want to go but couldn't stay. He whined soft and long, the kind of sound that makes you want to pick him up and tell him it's okay. I didn't move. I learned later, or at least more firmly, that moving was the only thing that felt safe and also like a betrayal. I slept badly that weekend. My dreams were full of basements lit by single bare bulbs and of a child's shoe, one shoe, sitting right on the bottom stair, waiting. When Steve and his wife came back, they took the dog and packed the car like nothing had happened, like they were escaping from a mildly inconvenient storm. I didn't say anything about the third night. Steve's wife gave me a tired, grateful hug and told me to keep the dog if I'd gotten attached. Max leapt into the car and then, looking back as they left, gave one last long, searching look at the house and then slid away into the back seat like he was leaving something there. I drove home with the windows down and the road using wind to try and scrub my head. For 2 weeks after, I couldn't sleep more than a few hours without getting up to check doors, windows, the stove. I would lie in bed and listen to my own building breathing at night, the pipes creaking, the neighbor's dog sometimes barking, and my mind would always wander to the basement and the child's shoe. Was it a lost shoe? A prank? A fabric of subconscious anxiety stitched together? There are reasonable explanations for everything. I stood in evidence against a supernatural claim like a prosecutor in a small local courtroom and tried to hammer down every angle that might explain what Max knew, and I didn't. Time cooled it down. Max's behavior stopped after a couple of weeks. It was like a fever that burned itself out. The images still come back when I hear a dog bark at a basement door on a late-night walk. The cold, the smell, the small shoe. I have asked Steve about it in passing since then, and he has said little. The conversation never goes where I want it to go. He'll change the subject, or he'll offer something airy like, "Dogs are weird." I have never asserted a label. I can't say what happened in that basement. All I can say is that my sense of the house's boundaries, the idea that your home is a sanctuary you fully control, felt fragile in a way I hadn't imagined. That fragility is a thing that settles under your skin. If that seems unnerving, then brace yourself. I promise the next one is different in texture and worse in its certainty. A few months after Steve's house, I moved into a ground-floor apartment in a building that calls itself secure on its leasing brochure. It sounded nice. A little balcony, a courtyard you could see from the kitchen window, and best of all, a peephole that gave you a tiny, round view of the world. You sleep with a different kind of confidence when your threshold is just a metal door and your building has gates and a camera that claims to watch the hallway. The first evening there, I lay on the couch and watched the winding credits of a show I didn't care much about, ate a sandwich I assembled with more care than skill, and felt the particular contentment of new curtains. I slept easy the first few nights, the way a person sleeps in an environment that, while new, hasn't yet made any demands. It started with small noises in the building hallway, running footsteps, a tiny infectious giggle, but they weren't footsteps like you would expect from adults. They were light and rhythmic, like children playing. I remember being confused because our building had a strict policy about noise after 11, and the idea of kids racing through the hallway at 1 in the morning struck me as improbable. I pulled back the curtains toward the bedroom one night to check and saw nothing. Empty hall, a shadow that resembled nothing. Then there were the knocks, a soft tapping like a fingernail against wood. The first time it happened, I opened the door and there was nobody there. Just the dirty scuff of the hallway floor and a folded piece of paper near the mat. I picked it up and it was blank. I chalked it up to neighborhood kids and bad timing. I'm not proud of this, but I did what most people do. I rationalized. The apartment manager, Roger, was a man who loved his security monitors. He owned the camera feed like it was an extension of pride. And when I mentioned the noises at the front of my building, he offered to pull footage for me. He called me later and said, "You should see this. It's grainy, but it's something." He sent a video clip clipped on his phone. The footage had the aesthetic of late-night CCTV, washed out black and white, a little jittery, with the timestamp in the corner that always makes everything matter more. On the screen, 2 figures hovered at my front door for almost 10 minutes. They were small, hooded, and their heads bobbed as if they were whispering to one another. They were inches from my door, leaning in at times like they were trying to hear the room's pulse. They touched the knob gently, not aggressively, like a child turning a toy over to see how it works. There were moments where they stood completely still for long stretches, as if listening to something beyond the camera's ears. Then they vanished from the frame and reappeared a few feet down the hall, peering into other doorways only to freeze again, unmoving. It was the kind of footage that suggests prank or sleepwalk or a film student with too much time, except there was no one else in the hallway at those hours, Roger told me. The timestamps were consistent. The way their heads bobbed was not like someone pretending. It was small, childlike, precise. That detail lodged in my throat. They were small, not simply disguised adults. I asked, "Do we have kids in the building?" Roger paused and said, "There used to be. A family upstairs years ago. Something happened. Hard to say." He trailed off like the rest was not important, or like he didn't want to summon the missing pieces. I started to notice other things. My peephole blurred sometimes, like someone had breathed lightly on it from the outside. On one late night, at 1:30 a.m., the door rattled hard enough that my heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't playful anymore. Someone, or something, was trying the knob, persistent enough to wake me. I looked through the peephole and saw 2 small heads bowed, bent at a scrim of distance that made them appear almost reverent. One of them looked up, and in a voice so quiet it might have been in my head, I heard, "Mom, we're home, please let us in." I don't know what I expected. I called the manager and he came over with a flashlight and a key on a ring. We checked the hallway and found no footprints, no marks, nothing that explained how 2 small people could vanish between cameras. Security and the police did come that night, polite and practical, and they found nothing to charge. The officer at the door suggested kids from a nearby school, or maybe someone messing with you, and then handed me a card and left. The manager's face looked strained. He said, "Maybe it's the previous tenants' kids. Indefinido." They were gone. People in here remember. Every night after that, I would wake at odd intervals and listen for the shuffle of small feet. The apartment felt like a stage you had entered uninvited. Noises became language, and I found myself translating them into scenarios that made sense, and then feeling foolish for my imagination. Once, in the dim grey of a pre-dawn hour, I walked to the door and set my ear to the wood, as if proximity might conjure a rational explanation. Nothing. Silence. The world was unhelpful. Roger showed me more footage a week later, zooming the camera and scraping through frames. There were times when the hallway would go blank, a camera glitch, and for a couple of seconds, frame by frame, the hooded shapes would dissolve and then not be there in the next instance. It was as if they were moving in and out of the recording like someone skipping a stone over a still lake. My skin crawled inside my sweatshirt. I began leaving my deadbolt on at night, double locking, using a chair jammed at the base of the door like an actor in a bad movie. The rational part of me arranged reasons, stray kids, pranks, technical anomalies, but then my practical measures felt ineffectual against something that either didn't obey the laws I respected or that had found a way inside those laws. Maybe I'm too credulous. Maybe the footage was a trick. Maybe the mind prefers narratives where babies press their noses to the door and beg to be let in. But then, in the corner of my living room, where late sunlight hit just right, I could still see the faint scuff marks at eye level, as if someone small had leaned and pushed. When the manager mentioned, in a voice that dropped suddenly serious, that the previous tenant lost children under circumstances he never explained, I felt the room tilt. He didn't give me dates, names, or the messy center of that grief. There was a pause, like someone whose memory didn't want to be disturbed. I pushed, and Roger wouldn't say more. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe people in property management don't like to entangle themselves in heartbreak. Or maybe there are things that are socially inconvenient to explain. I moved out 6 weeks later. I told myself it was because the commute was bad. The truth is, I couldn't sleep properly under a roof that seemed to listen. Before I left, I checked the hallway once more. The camera feed didn't show anything unusual the day I moved, and the building hummed with the normal noise of people carrying boxes and tape. But at night, as I packed a box and the room began to echo with absence, I heard a whispering sound in the stairwell. It might have been a breeze playing with a piece of torn cardboard, or a neighbor slamming a door. It might have been nothing at all, the kind of nothing that convinces you of something else. If the basement felt like the house's bones had whispered, this one felt like the threshold itself had enfolded some memory and didn't want to fully release it back to the world. The footage, those small hooded figures, sat in my head like grainy evidence should, never full, never complete. I could end the story there and tell you I left and never looked back, but I didn't leave without one more thing. A folded scrap of paper I found tucked under my doormat the morning I boxed the last plate. It was blank, except for a child's thumbprint in smudged blue ink on the corner. I kept it in a drawer for a while before I threw it away. Sometimes you keep objects because they are talismans against your own memory. Sometimes you keep them to prove you were awake. You'd think after 2 near-home invasions I'd be done, paranoid and cautious, and living in a hotel with a night clerk named Harold who knew when to change my towels. But the last story I want to tell you is the one that stuck to my life the longest, the one that changed how I moved through my day and who I trusted to come near my car or my kitchen. It involved notes that started like compliments and ended like a declaration. One Tuesday, after a long shift where everyone else had worn patience thin with their own problems, I climbed into my car and found a neon-pink sticky note tucked under the handle. It was the kind of bright, stupid color that seems to demand your attention like a highlighter screaming, "Notice me." The note had a sentence written in block letters, "You have a nice smile." No signature. I laughed, half embarrassed, half flattered. Someone had taken the time to peel a sticky note and thread it under the handle of my car. Maybe it was a stranger's harmless attempt at connection. Maybe someone from work trying to be funny. Over the next week, more notes appeared. At first they were harmless, nice shoes and funny laugh. I began to look forward to them in a shallow way, a silly secret like a tiny sunburst arranged by a phantom pen pal. They showed up on my windshield, tucked under wipers, on the driver's seat when I opened the door. Whoever was doing it had a taste for bright neon. You'd see these little pink splashes and your mood would lift in small increments. Then one morning, I found a note on my car that spelled a sentence I'd never seen on a sticky note in my life. "You look cute when you're sleeping." I felt my stomach drop. The sentence rang wrong like a door coming off its hinge. It meant proximity in a way that nice smile had not. It meant someone had been near my car while I wasn't looking, possibly close enough to linger and watch. The hair along my arms rose, and I checked the lot like a person who had lost something important. I told one co-worker, half joking, because the human instinct is to laugh in the face of unsettling things. She told me to be careful, installed me with the idea of changing my route home, and suggested maybe someone was playing a dare. The idea that a stranger was fascinated enough to watch me sleep felt less like alarm and more like violation. I started parking under different lights, circling the block before I came home, checking the undercarriage. It changed the way I moved in the world by half-degree increments. I glanced behind me more. I checked car interiors more. I learned where the reflective garbage could be anywhere near my apartment. The notes escalated in tone. Flirtation turned into a presumption. The messages grew longer, and an edge crept into the handwriting as if the person pressing ink to paper was practicing control. I know where you live. It was the kind of line that sits in your mouth like a hot stone. It has weight, it provides proof, and it removes a pretense you had been allowed to keep. I called the police. They took a report, showed up politely, asked if I had enemies, asked if I'd annoyed anyone at work. They were sympathetic in the way people are when they know there's nothing pressing to apprehend. They suggested cameras. They didn't promise protection. Then a note appeared inside my house. I kept my keys on the counter. I always had. Habit formed by convenience and laziness. That morning, there was a note stuck to the refrigerator. You can't keep me away. I stared at it for a full minute, tongue numb. The note wasn't on the door like a prank. It was inside my refrigerator. For that to be true, someone had to have been in my home. There were no signs of forced entry. My locks were the basic kind that keep honest people out. The police came again. They searched for prints, but those things can be messy. If a person is careful, if a person knows how to avoid leaving a trace, you will be left with questions rather than answers. I replaced the locks, installed a camera that hooked to my phone like a digital eye I could query at 3 in the morning if paranoia woke me. The camera mostly showed me being anxious. It recorded nothing decisive. It recorded door frames, my cat pacing, my own nervous pacing. Every night I would check the feed before bed, as if the reassurance of a digital image could outmatch the cold fact that someone had been close enough to my sleep to leave a note. For months the notes came less frequently. They were like a wave that rose and then receded. I replaced the bulbs in the porch light, bought a car alarm with an obnoxious sound, and told myself that was the end of it. I moved yards, then neighborhoods, then towns, getting married somewhere in the middle of a calendar that refused to be what I wanted. Life smoothed over a lot of the tension. But years later, months after the wedding, I found one more neon pink sticky note waiting on the porch of the house my partner and I had bought together. It said, "I guess you don't want to play anymore." That line was not about me anymore. It was about the idea that someone had been devoted to a ritual of presence and had decided the ritual was over. It might have been a final, petty goodbye. It might have been a lingering assertion of power. Maybe it was meant to terrify. Maybe it was meant to wound. Either way, the note left a scar on how I think about home. It illuminated the simple truth that safety is sometimes a social contract, not a physical one. That the people who know where you live, even in small ways, can choose to use that knowledge. The police didn't find a culprit. Cameras and locks changed things, but they didn't reveal who had enjoyed the ritual or why they'd stopped. 3 stories, 3 ways the domestic frontier feels porous. In each, there are ordinary objects, a child's shoe, a peephole, a neon pink sticky note, that become evidence of something difficult to name. I could sit here and give you tidy explanations for all of it. Drafts and sleepwalking, kids with a taste for mischief, co-workers with a warped sense of humor. All of those things might be true, They're plausible. They're the things I told myself when trying to sleep. But plausibility doesn't always translate to peace. I've told you the basement in full, the cold and the stealth of the smell, and Max is barking at 3:21 a.m. I've told you about the hooded figures outside my door, the grainy camera, and the whisper, "Mom, we're home." And I've told you about the neon pink notes that started as compliments and became a campaign of proximity. I have not, and I will not tell you I know what these were. I can't point at a single cause and say, there is your answer. That would be easier for everyone. Instead, I will end where all three of these stories end for me. Unresolved, a little raw, and with the knowledge that once your idea of home is punctured, it can be very difficult to hold it together the same way. But I'm not finished telling you everything. There's more, details I held back because they felt like little splinters in my skull, vivid and stubborn. There are moments that, when replayed, make the hair on my arms stand up in their own memory. And the second story, the one with the hooded figures, has frames of footage and a night where something happened that changed my sense of presence entirely. If you want me to keep going, if you want the rest of it, let me know what you think is happening. Who or what do you assume stands outside your threshold when the lights go out? Tell me which of the three freaked you out the most. And if you've ever found a note on your car or heard a child's whisper at your door, write it down. I'm listening. There are a few things I left out earlier because they felt too small, and yet it's the small things that keep gnawing at me. They were the details that didn't make good sound bites, but stuck like grit under a thumbnail. A single frame on a grainy video, the way the peephole fogged for half a second, the precise tilt of a hooded head. Those tiny moments are what made me stop treating these as weird anecdotes and start treating them like something I had to live around. With the apartment footage, for example, I watched it on loop more than once, late into the night, when the rest of the world had gone quiet and my own rational mind felt thin. You can tell yourself a lot when you look at a single grainy clip. Camera angles hide things, light plays tricks, people can be small adults bent over to look like children. But there was one section, maybe 12 seconds, that sat in the middle of the clip and refused to be explained away for me. In that stretch, the two figures are at the door, inches from the knob. One leans forward and seems to press its face to the seam where the peephole sits. The camera jumps. There's a flicker, a tiny smear of white, and then for an instant the figures are not blurred. They're almost clear. Not clear like HD, not clear like you could read a face, but just plausible in a way that makes you stop moving. I remember pausing there and zooming until the image made my laptop protest. There was a bobbing motion, like two heads whispering to each other. And then a tiny, quick motion that could have been a hand, or nothing at all. The frame after it looked normal again, as if someone had rolled film wrong. Roger later told me sometimes the cameras glitch, they freeze, and then skip. That's the kind of explanation that makes you sleep better for a night, but it doesn't unstick that frame from your memory. When the image shivered like that, it felt less like evidence and more like someone reaching through a slit between what we record and what we experience. The night that changed my sense of presence wasn't spectacular in the classic cinematic sense. It was quiet, domestic, close in the way that makes ordinary things sharper. I was up late, folding laundry across from the door because I liked the way the table light softened the apartment. At around 1 in the morning, I heard a hollow knock, 3 beats, like a small fist tapping on wood. I expected childish energy to run off, but the knock wasn't playful. It was deliberate and timed, like something meant to be heard. I walked to the door and peered through the peephole. 2 small heads bowed there again, as if they couldn't look up without something catching them. I remember thinking, rationally and loudly in my head, that I should call Roger, that I should step out into the hall, that I should do anything but look. Then one of them spoke, soft enough to be mistaken for the apartment, breathing, "Mom, we're home. Please, let us in." The words were private sounding, like someone who assumes your household's memory. They weren't an accusation, they were a plea. The sound lodged under my ribs. I don't know if that was the moment my skepticism frayed or the moment it finally unraveled. What I do remember is the way the floor felt different under my feet after that. My home had been a bunch of objects arranged for comfort. Now it felt like it had been annotated by someone else's presence. For weeks afterwards, I would stand with my hand on the knob and feel the wood warm slightly beneath my palm, as if someone had recently held it. Sometimes in the middle of the night I'd smell a faint thing, like a child's shampoo or the wet cotton of a mitt, impossible and sudden and gone by the time I blinked. It could be coincidence. It could be how our minds rehearse memory when we're sleep-deprived. It could be nothing, but it pushed my sense of threshold from being a line of defense into something porous. Roger's half-answers didn't help. He mentioned the previous tenant's children with a hesitation that felt like someone stepping around a hollow in conversation. "Indefinido," he'd say, filling the silence with a blank. People can be evasive for reasons that have nothing to do with the truth. Privacy, shame, the landlord's instinct to avoid lawsuits. But sometimes, when you combine omission with a grainy clip and the sound of a child's pleading, the omission becomes its own kind of evidence. The building itself kept behaving like a place that held a memory and didn't want to let it go. After I moved out, people asked me if I ever thought about staying and fighting it out. The answer is no. I left because I didn't trust my own nights anymore. Not because the place felt dangerous in an obvious way, but because the cumulative effect of those small things was a constant erasure of certainty. You sleep better when you can tell yourself the story you prefer, prank, mechanical failure. But the longer a story refuses to sit tight inside one tidy explanation, the more it will shape how you move through life. The basement and the notes have their own echo. With Steve's house, the image that won't leave me is Max, the dog, on the threshold of the basement, hair standing like hedgerow, barking at 3:21 a.m. Those early morning hours have a clarity to them that daylight doesn't. They expose the seams. For weeks I would listen for household sounds, the way a diver listens for a signal, taut and expecting a ping. I'd wake to the ordinary creaks and find my thoughts slipping into that cold, copper-tinged air. The small rubber shoe kept appearing at the edges of dreams. I would wake with my fingers pressed to a mattress where the shape of a child's shoe lingered like a story the brain couldn't resolve. And then there are the sticky notes, which taught me how proximity feels when it's weaponized into persistence. That neon pink punctured my day like an exclamation point. The first ones were easy to dismiss. The last one, "I guess you don't want to play anymore," came years later but landed like a sentence into a life that had reconstructed itself around the idea of safety. After that final note, I found myself measuring the mundane for risk. Who knew my work schedule? Who parked near me? Who had the dexterity to tuck a paper where no one would see it? It complicated how intimacy works. You assume closeness is warm? These notes taught me closeness can be arranged and used. These experiences did something quieter than make me a believer or a follower of a particular explanation. They made me more suspicious of the stories I tell myself to sleep. They made me more attentive to small anomalies. And they made me care about how unexplainable things erode trust, which is an odd, slow violence. You don't get curtains torn down. You get little permissions revoked. Don't leave the door unlocked. Don't park in the dark. Don't blush at compliments you didn't ask for. There were practical steps, of course. Locks, cameras, police reports, friends who offered couch space and therapists who helped sort the tangible anxiety from the narrative dread. Sometimes the cameras gave me footage of raccoons. Once a raccoon got bold and pawed at the trash, ridiculous garden variety wildlife behavior that my mind read as something more. Sometimes the police left business cards and sympathetic smiles. Nothing decisive ever turned up. No arrest, no confession, no definitive moment where you could say, "There, now it makes sense." The absence of an answer is part of it, the way a void takes on shape by what you keep pushing against it. I've tried to be honest with you about what happened and how it left me. Honesty, for me, looks like admitting I don't have a tidy theory. It looks like admitting that the things I encountered may yet be fully explainable, and that my telling them here is only a witness statement. But there's also this. I can't stand the idea that a reader might slip into a late hour and feel that same little chill and think they're alone in it. There are people who have their own small private narratives that make doors feel different. Telling stories is how we share the burden of that unease. So what do I take with me? A few habits. I double-check deadbolts with the muscle memory of someone who learned to do two things at once: lock and breathe. I keep a tiny light by the bed. Sometimes when the house is very quiet, I read the news or a book aloud. Not to anyone, just to hear a human voice fill a room. I keep one neon pink sticky note folded and tucked in a small box I can't quite throw away. It feels like proof that something happened, even if I can't pin down the why. And when a dog barks at a basement door in the middle of the night, I listen differently now. I don't assume I can always translate what a body knows into language my mind can file away. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. I know some of you will have theories, pranks, sleep disorders, electrical anomalies, remaining grief in old buildings. Offer them. I want to hear them, not because I expect one to wrap everything up, but because the sharing is part of how we stay human in the face of things that defy a clean explanation. Tell me which of the three freaked you out most. Tell me if you've ever found a note on your car, or seen a pair of hooded figures on a security clip, or woken to a dog's frantic barking at a door you thought was safe. If this unnerved you, if it made the corners of your apartment feel different for a minute, do me one favor: like the video, subscribe, and leave your theory in the comments. I read them. I think about them. And sometimes your guesses help the edges of my memories make a little more sense. One last thing before I go. On nights when the world is quiet and your house feels like an island, remember that not all intrusions come with footprints. Some come as little notes, some as a barking that won't stop, some as a voice that sounds like a child asking to be let in. They may have explanations yet undiscovered, or they may not. Either way, when a small sound at your door tastes like a memory that isn't yours, pay attention. It will teach you how fragile the sense of home can be.